What happens when Hollywood royalty meets actual royalty, and the cameras are still rolling? You won't believe what unfolded last night on the Drew Barrymore show, when what started as a friendly celebrity chat turned into the most explosive confrontation daytime television has seen in years. When Meghan Markle sat down across from Drew Barrymore, nobody expected the conversation to spiral into accusations, denials, and ultimately a dramatic walkout that left the studio audience gasping, and Drew herself visibly shaken. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two of entertainment's biggest personalities clash in ways that neither of them saw coming. The atmosphere in Studio 6B felt different from the moment Meghan Markle walked onto the set. Drew Barrymore, known for her warm, effusive interview style, greeted her guest with the usual enthusiasm, but there was something in Meghan's demeanor that suggested this wasn't going to be just another promotional appearance. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer and carrying herself with the practiced poise of someone accustomed to scrutiny, Meghan settled into the plush interview chair with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome back to the show," Drew began, her trademark warmth radiating through the studio as the audience applauded. "I have to say, it's always such a pleasure to have you here. You look absolutely radiant." The compliment hung in the air as Meghan's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that would prove to be the first warning sign of what was to come. "Thank you, Drew," Meghan replied, her voice carrying that carefully modulated tone she'd perfected during her brief acting career and refined during her time as a working royal. "It's wonderful to be here, though I have to admit, I'm a bit surprised by some of the questions your producers suggested we might cover today." Drew's eyebrows lifted slightly, caught off guard by the immediate shift towards something more pointed. The seasoned talk show host had interviewed countless celebrities over the years, but there was something in Meghan's tone that suggested she hadn't come to play by the usual rules of celebrity promotion. "Oh well, you know how it is." Drew laughed, trying to maintain the light atmosphere that had made her show a daytime favorite. "We like to keep things interesting for our viewers. They love getting to know the real you." "The real me," Meghan repeated, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "That's interesting phrasing, Drew, because I've been wondering lately about what people think they know about the real me, and where those perceptions are coming from." She shifted in her chair, and the studio lights caught the subtle tension in her posture. "Your research team reached out to my representatives with some rather pointed questions about my family relationships, my time in the royal family, and some very personal matters that I frankly found invasive." The audience, sensing the shift in energy, fell silent. Drew, to her credit, maintained her composure, but the practiced smile flickered for just a moment. "Well, I think our viewers are just curious about your journey," she offered, her voice still warm but now carrying an underlying note of caution. "You've been through so much, and people admire your strength in speaking your truth." "Speaking my truth," Meghan said, leaning forward slightly. "There's that phrase again. It's fascinating how that's become the go-to description for anything I say publicly. As if my experiences, my reality, are somehow subjective rather than factual." Her voice remained controlled, but there was an unmistakable intensity building. "I notice that when other people share their experiences, we don't qualify it as their truth. We just call it truth." Drew shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting the conversation to take such a pointed turn so early. "I think people just recognize that everyone has their own perspective on events," she said carefully, trying to navigate what was rapidly becoming treacherous conversational territory. "And your perspective has been incredibly valuable in starting important conversations about mental health, racism, and institutional change." "My perspective," Meghan repeated, her tone now carrying a distinct chill. "Drew, can I ask you something directly? Did you watch the interview I did with Oprah?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Drew's hesitation was telling. "Because I'm getting the sense that a lot of people form their opinions about me based on headlines and social media clips, rather than actually listening to what I said." "Of course I watched it," Drew replied quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "It was a very powerful conversation. Very revealing." She paused, clearly trying to find safer ground. I think what struck me most was your vulnerability in sharing such personal struggles. Meghan's laugh was sharp, lacking any warmth. Vulnerability. Another interesting word choice. When I spoke about experiencing suicidal thoughts and being denied help, that was vulnerability. When I discussed experiencing racism within the royal institution, that was vulnerability. But when I defend myself against false narratives or set the record straight about actual events, suddenly I'm being difficult or demanding. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving Drew's face. Do you see the difference there? The tension in the studio was now palpable. Audience members were exchanging glances, sensing that they were witnessing something far removed from the typical celebrity chat show moment. Drew, clearly rattled, attempted to regain control of the conversation. I don't think anyone sees you as difficult, she said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. I think people just want to understand your experience. Do they? Meghan challenged. Because from where I sit, it feels more like people want to dissect my experience, to find the parts that make them uncomfortable and dismiss those while keeping the parts that fit their preconceived narratives. Her voice was rising slightly, though she maintained her composure. You mentioned your research team's questions earlier. One of them was about my relationship with my father. Another was about alleged conflicts with palace staff. These aren't random topics, Drew. These are carefully chosen talking points designed to put me in a defensive position. Drew's face flushed slightly. Our producers do research to make sure we're asking relevant questions that our audience wants to hear about, she defended. It's not meant to be confrontational. Isn't it, though? Meghan's voice cut through the studio like a blade. When the questions are premised on tabloid stories and unverified claims, when they're designed to make me relitigate the same false narratives over and over again, she paused, her eyes narrowing. Tell me, Drew, when you have other guests on who faced public scrutiny, do you ask them to repeatedly defend themselves against every negative story that's ever been written about them? The question hung in the air, and Drew's silence spoke volumes. The audience was now completely captivated, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a celebrity getting defensive about negative coverage. This was a systematic dismantling of the very premise of the interview itself. But what came next would shatter any remaining pretense of civility and set the stage for an even more explosive confrontation. Drew cleared her throat, her media training kicking in as she attempted to redirect the conversation. Look, Meghan, I think there might be some misunderstanding here about our intentions, she began, but her voice carried a defensive edge that hadn't been there moments before. We're not trying to ambush you or relitigate anything. We just thought our viewers would appreciate hearing your side of things. My side of things? Meghan repeated, her tone now ice cold. As opposed to what, Drew? The other side? Because let me be very clear about something. There isn't another side to my lived experience. There isn't another side to racism. There isn't another side to being pushed to the brink of suicide and being told that getting help would be bad for the institution. Her voice was steady, but the fury behind it was unmistakable. So, when you say you want to hear my side, what you're really saying is that you want me to perform my trauma for your audience's entertainment. The accusation hit Drew like a physical blow. Her face went pale, and for a moment, she seemed genuinely speechless. The audience was dead silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. That's not what this is about, Drew stammered, clearly shaken by the direct challenge to her show's integrity and her own motivations as a host. Isn't it? Meghan pressed, leaning forward in her chair with predatory intensity. Because I've done my research too, Drew. I know about your other interviews with controversial figures. I know about how you approach these conversations. You create this warm, safe space facade, and then you slip in the knife when your guests are most vulnerable. She paused, letting the words sink in. You did it to Martha Stewart when she was dealing with her legal troubles. You did it to Britney during her breakdown. And now you're trying to do it to me. Drew's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. That's completely unfair, she finally managed, her voice cracking slightly. I've always tried to create a supportive environment for my guests. I would never deliberately try to harm anyone. Supportive? Meghan's laugh was bitter and sharp. Drew, your producers sent over a list of suggested talking points that included asking me about my pattern of cutting people out of my life, and whether I felt responsible for the rift in the royal family. How exactly is that supportive? She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Should I read the rest? Because there are some real gems in here. The color drained completely from Drew's face as she realized Meghan had come armed with documentation. The studio audience collectively held their breath, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented in daytime television. Those were just suggestions, Drew said weakly. We would never have used them without your approval. Without my approval? Meghan's voice rose for the first time, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. Drew, the fact that these questions were even conceived shows exactly what kind of interview you intended this to be. These aren't questions you ask someone you respect. These are questions you ask someone you're trying to trap. She unfolded the paper with deliberate precision. Question 7. Do you ever worry that your public statements have damaged the monarchy's reputation? Question 12. How do you respond to critics who say you've used your royal connection for personal gain? Should I continue? Drew looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Meghan, please. I think there's been a serious miscommunication here. Those questions weren't meant to be accusatory. They were meant to give you a platform to address the criticism directly. Address the criticism? Meghan's voice was now sharp enough to cut glass. Drew, do you realize what you just said? You're asking me to address criticism based on lies and racist tropes, thereby legitimizing those very lies and tropes. You're asking me to dignify completely fabricated narratives with a response which only serves to perpetuate them. She stood up slightly in her chair, her presence becoming more commanding. This is exactly the kind of media manipulation that drove me out of public life in the first place. The accusation hung heavy in the air, and Drew's face went from pale to flushed. Media manipulation? Meghan, that's a very serious accusation. I've been in this business for decades, and I've always prided myself on honest, authentic conversations with my guests. Honest and authentic. Meghan's voice dripped with disdain. Then let's be honest and authentic, shall we? Let's talk about the fact that your show contacted 3 different tabloid journalists to verify stories about me before this interview. Let's talk about how your research team reached out to palace sources who have been spreading false information about me for years. Her voice was building to a crescendo, each word delivered with surgical precision. If you wanted honest and authentic, you would have come to me directly instead of building your questions around gossip and speculation. Drew's composure was completely shattered now. How do you know about our research process? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because, unlike you, I actually do my homework, Meghan replied coldly. I know exactly who you've been talking to, and I know exactly what narrative you were hoping to create here today. The supportive host helping the troubled former royal work through her issues, the redemption story angle, the healing journey narrative, all very marketable, all very ratings-friendly, and all completely dishonest. The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even the camera operators seemed frozen in place, unsure whether they should continue filming or cut away from what was rapidly becoming a complete disaster. Drew looked around desperately, as if hoping for someone to throw her a lifeline, but she was completely on her own in the face of Meghan's systematic dismantling of the entire interview premise. I think, Drew said slowly, trying to regain some semblance of control, that maybe we should take a quick break and regroup. This clearly isn't going the way either of us intended. Oh, but it's going exactly the way I intended, Meghan said, her smile returning but now carrying a distinctly predatory quality. Because for once, someone is going to call out the media machine that feeds on trauma and controversy while pretending to be compassionate and supportive. She looked directly into the main camera. Your viewers deserve to know how these shows really work. They deserve to know that the questions aren't spontaneous, that the narratives are predetermined, and that the so-called supportive environment is actually a carefully constructed trap designed to extract the most dramatic content possible. Drew's face was now bright red. Whether from embarrassment, anger, or both was impossible to tell. Meghan, I think you're being completely unfair. This show has always been about celebrating people's journeys and helping them share their stories in a supportive way. Supportive? Meghan's voice was now rising dangerously. Drew, there is nothing supportive about ambush journalism disguised as friendly conversation. There is nothing supportive about perpetuating harmful stereotypes and false narratives. And there is absolutely nothing supportive about trying to profit from someone's pain while pretending to be their friend. The words hit Drew like a slap in the face, and for a moment, her own mask slipped completely. You know what, Meghan? Maybe the problem isn't with the questions. Maybe the problem is that you can't handle any level of accountability or scrutiny without playing the victim card. The moment the words left Drew's mouth, the entire atmosphere in the studio changed. It was as if a bomb had gone off, and the fallout was about to be catastrophic. The silence that followed Drew's accusation was deafening. Meghan sat perfectly still, for what felt like an eternity, her face cycling through a range of emotions: shock, hurt, and finally, pure rage. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that everyone in the studio had to strain to hear her, but the venom in her words was unmistakable. Playing the victim card, she repeated slowly, each word dripping with controlled fury. Playing the victim card. She stood up from her chair with fluid grace, her full height commanding the space as she towered over the seated Drew. You know what, Drew? You just revealed everything I needed to know about who you really are and what this conversation was always meant to be. Drew immediately realized her mistake, her face crumpling as she tried to backtrack. Meghan, I didn't mean it like that. I was just frustrated. I spoke without thinking. Please, let's just take a breath and… No. Meghan cut her off, her voice now carrying the full force of her fury. You don't get to walk that back. You don't get to reveal your true feelings and then pretend it was just frustration. That comment came from somewhere deep inside you, Drew. That's what you really think of me, isn't it? That I'm just playing victim when I talk about experiencing racism, when I talk about being suicidal, when I talk about being systematically destroyed by an institution and a media machine that profits from tearing women down. The audience was completely transfixed, some members visibly uncomfortable, as they witnessed what was clearly becoming a career-defining moment for both women. Drew looked around desperately, her eyes pleading with her producers off camera, but there was no escape from what she had unleashed. Meghan, please. I apologize. That was completely out of line, Drew said, her voice cracking with desperation. I've been defensive because I feel like you're attacking my integrity and the integrity of my show, but that's no excuse for what I just said. Your integrity? Meghan's laugh was hollow and bitter. Drew, you lost any claim to integrity the moment you decided to build this interview around tabloid gossip and palace propaganda. You lost it when you chose to platform racist narratives disguised as legitimate questions. And you absolutely lost it when you just dismissed my lived experiences as playing the victim card. She moved closer to Drew's chair, her presence now completely dominating the space. Do you have any idea what it's like to have every aspect of your existence scrutinized, twisted, and weaponized against you? Do you know what it's like to watch people profit from lies about you while you're told to stay silent for the good of everyone else? Drew shrank back in her chair, looking smaller and more vulnerable than anyone had ever seen her on television. I can't imagine, she whispered. No, you can't, Meghan agreed, her voice cutting through the studio like a blade. Because when your life fell apart publicly, when you went through your struggles with addiction and personal issues, the media treated you with compassion. They talked about your journey, your recovery, your strength. They never questioned whether your pain was real or whether you were just seeking attention. She paused, letting the comparison sink in. But when a black woman faces institutional racism and speaks about it, suddenly she's playing the victim card. When a black woman refuses to be silently destroyed, suddenly she's difficult and demanding. The racial element that had been lurking beneath the surface of their entire confrontation was now fully exposed, and Drew looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. Several audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. the weight of Meghan's words settling over the studio like a heavy blanket. "Meghan, I never thought about it in those terms," Drew said weakly. "I would never want to contribute to that kind of double standard." "But you did contribute to it," Meghan shot back. "You contributed to it the moment you decided that my experiences were up for debate. You contributed to it when you treated proven lies as legitimate talking points. And you absolutely contributed to it when you just accused me of playing the victim card for speaking my truth." She moved toward the side of the set, her body language making it clear that she was done with this conversation. "This is exactly why I stepped away from public life, and this is exactly why I'm walking away from this interview right now." "Meghan, please don't go," Drew pleaded, finally standing up from her own chair. "Let's work through this. Let's have the conversation we should have been having from the beginning." "The conversation we should have been having?" Meghan turned back to face her, her eyebrows raised in incredulous disbelief. "Drew, that ship sailed the moment you decided to ambush me with tabloid talking points. It sailed when you revealed that you've been conducting secret research with my enemies. And it absolutely sailed when you showed your true colors by dismissing everything I've been through as playing victim." She shook her head, a sad smile playing at her lips. "You know what the real tragedy is here. I actually thought you might be different. I thought you might actually understand what it's like to be a woman who's been torn down by the media machine." Drew's face crumpled completely. "I do understand. I've been through my own struggles with public scrutiny and media judgment. I thought we could connect on that level." "But that's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Meghan said, her voice now carrying a note of profound disappointment rather than anger. "You thought you understood, but you don't. Because when you were struggling, the world rallied around you. When you needed help, you got it. When you spoke your truth, people listened with compassion. But when I do the same things, I'm accused of being manipulative, attention-seeking, and playing victim." She gestured around the studio. "This entire setup proves that you never intended to treat me with the same respect and compassion that you demand for yourself." The brutal honesty of her words left Drew speechless. She stood there, mouth agape, as Meghan began removing her microphone with practiced efficiency. The sound technicians looked around nervously, unsure whether they should approach or stay back as the situation continued to deteriorate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Meghan said, addressing the audience directly as she unclipped her mic pack, "what you've witnessed here today is exactly how the media machine works. They invite you in with promises of fair treatment and supportive conversation. They do their research by consulting your enemies and detractors. They craft their questions around predetermined narratives designed to make you look bad. And then when you refuse to play along, they accuse you of being difficult or playing victim." She handed her microphone to a stunned production assistant. "This is why so many people, especially women of color, choose to step away from these kinds of platforms. Because the game is rigged from the start." Drew made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Meghan, please. I know I made mistakes here today, but we can fix this. We can edit out the parts that went wrong and focus on the positive message you want to share." The suggestion seemed to be the final straw for Meghan. She turned to face Drew one last time, her expression a mixture of pity and disgust. "Edit out the parts that went wrong?" "Drew, the part that went wrong was agreeing to do this interview in the first place. The part that went wrong was believing that you were different from every other media personality who's tried to profit from my story." She gathered her purse and began walking toward the exit. "The part that went wrong was thinking that there was any possibility of having an honest conversation in an environment built on dishonesty and manipulation." As Meghan reached the edge of the set, she paused and turned back one final time. "For what it's worth, Drew, I hope you learned something from this. I hope you think about the questions you ask and why you ask them. I hope you consider whether you're building people up or tearing them down. And I hope you remember that the person sitting across from you in that chair is a human being with real feelings, real experiences, and real pain that shouldn't be exploited for entertainment value." With that, Meghan Markle walked off the Drew Barrymore show set, leaving behind a stunned audience, a devastated host, and what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked about moments in daytime television history. Drew stood frozen in place for several long moments before finally sinking back into her chair, her face in her hands, as the cameras continued to roll and capture every moment of her complete professional humiliation. The confrontation was over, but its impact would reverberate through the entertainment industry for years to come.